Thank you again for the opportunity to speak. I'm very excited to do so. As Eric said, I'm the state ornithologist with the Missouri Department of Conservation. I'm a little bit about me. I am a Missouri native. I was born in Brookfield, not so far from Kansas City, and moved around and spent most of my life as a kid growing up in Kirksville, Missouri. So I'm from Missouri and I'm honored to be the state ornithologist, and it's just a wonderful job. The Brown-headed Nuthatch reintroduction has probably been one of the funnest projects I've worked on, which is saying a lot because I do a lot of fun projects. But I do love this project. It's near and dear to my heart, and it's been an amazing partnership amongst many, many entities, as you will see. So I'll just go ahead and get started so we have enough time to cover everything. Okay. So a little bit about the background of this project, why we would reintroduce the brown-headed nuthatch to Missouri. So conservation partners have been chatting and discussing this reintroduction for about a decade. And right off the bat, I want to acknowledge how vital all of the partners listed here on the screen were in this reintroduction. We really could not have done it without any one of these people. It really was a massive partnership. So shortly after taking the ornithologist position in 2017, my advisor for my thesis at the University of Missouri, he works for the Forest Service, his name is Frank Thompson. We were sitting around chatting about projects and things like that, and the brown-headed nuthatch idea came up. And so we really started to say, what would it take? Who would we have to talk to? What permits would we have to do? What analyses would we have to do on the background to get this done? And so we talked to a lot of people and asked a lot of questions, and all the partners on this project were really, really vital. So right off the bat, I have to thank these 4 people in particular. So Frank Thompson, it works for the Forest Service. He's a biologist. Tom Bono works for the University of Missouri. He's a professor. And the 3 of us really spearheaded this effort and came to the analyses that we had to do before we did the reintroduction. Kristen Heath was hired on a few months later, running the brown-headed nuthatch reintroduction with us. And then Amanda Heltzel was recently hired to help us in the field as well. So it's been a really cool, fun effort with all of these many partners. So communication was clearly key, and we had to keep in close contact with everyone throughout this process to see if it was feasible. So a little bit about the brown-headed nuthatch. As Eric mentioned, it is a small songbird of pine woodlands. It's a resident bird and a cooperative breeder. They require this habitat for their natural history. You can see an abundance map here across the southeastern portion of the state. This is from eBird, which is an online database of birder checklists. So you can see where they're more and less abundant. You can see their range goes up into northern Arkansas, which are the breeding populations that this bird, that we brought the birds from. And so they're a cooperative breeder, which means that usually second-year males predominantly help the parents with nest building and care of the brood the following year. And so they're common and widespread, and they are not included on any regional or conservation lists. And this is what they sound like. Okay, so habitat requirements of this bird is that they require an open understory or a woodland habitat type, which if you're not aware, I'll show some pictures here on a few slides. But woodland requires an open canopy. Forest is generally closed in, unmanaged, with a closed canopy. Woodland, you remove some of the trees to allow sunlight to get through the canopy to reach the woodland floor. And that causes a rich vegetative layer on that woodland floor. So they require this open woodland with an open understory. This requires mature pines because the birds forage up in the canopy, high up in the cones. They eat insects and the seeds out of cones up in the top. And they require pine snags or dead standing trees for nesting because they excavate their own cavities every single year. Their presence on the landscape benefits other small cavity nesters who can't excavate their own nesting cavities like chickadees and titmice and others. So as Eric also mentioned, these birds are extirpated in the state. So until last year, these birds had the official status of extirpated in Missouri. So we have a few historic records of the birds in Missouri from the late 1800s and early 1900s. Shortleaf pine oak woodland once covered over 6 million acres in the Missouri Ozarks. In fact, and about 4.2 million of those were estimated to have been pine acres. So most of our Missouri Ozarks were shortleaf pine, which is our only native pine tree species. So it used to be predominantly pine in the late 1800s, early 1900s. The Missouri Ozarks were almost completely denuded and removed in logging efforts. So these massive efforts removed nearly all of the shortleaf pine across southern Missouri. And once these pines were removed, the forest succeeded into oak and hickory forest. So the bird may have left the state in the early 1900s when these last large swaths of pine woodland were removed, but we just don't know for sure when they may have left. So you can see from these historic photos provided from the Ozark National Scenic Riverways that in these old logging efforts with these horse-drawn carts with logs on them, you see this is from Grandin Mill, which was one of the largest logging mills at the time down in our Ozarks. All the logs are pines. You look back here on the horizon and all of them are pines. So there was a lot of pine in our Missouri Ozarks. And when we lost that habitat, we may have lost the bird because they require pines. So next, this is a range map of shortleaf pine in the southeastern states. The black outline is the historic range of shortleaf pine, and the red is current shortleaf pine. Now, this isn't the shortleaf pine woodland I mentioned that needs that open nature and management, but it is shortleaf pine. So the habitat these birds requires that management, removal of some trees, and then prescribed fires every few years to maintain that open structure. So how did this come about in Missouri? How were shortleaf pine woodlands restored? So it's all part of the CFLRP, which is a crazy acronym, the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Project. So the CFLRP is a nationwide Forest Service grant program where different Forest Service districts can apply for funding for large-scale management across a landscape. So our Mark Twain National Forest districts applied for a pine oak woodlands restoration project. So this dumped and they were awarded it. So this dumped millions of dollars into the restoration of shortleaf pine in our Ozarks over the last 20 plus years. So they're reapplying for this funding. They're continuing this management. And so this gives us a lot of confidence that the habitat is going to continue. So the brown-headed nuthatch is a resident bird. It's non-migratory. It stays put. It doesn't make these long-distance migrations. And so it's a resident bird. It makes few long-distance dispersals. So dispersals are when the juvenile birds are fledged, they leave their parents, and they disperse to their own territory. They leave their parents' territory. This bird disperses in pretty short distances, 3, 5, 6, 7 kilometers. So it makes only these short distance movements when it disperses. And so the natural recolonization of restored pine woodlands up here in Missouri, about 200 miles from their current breeding range down in Arkansas, is highly unlikely unless they have patches of shortleaf pine woodland to hop between to eventually move north. And so, so that's the background there. This is a photo of one of the areas where we release birds. This is pine woodland. And yes, this exists in Missouri and it's beautiful and you should definitely go see it if you can. So again, what is a woodland? It's that opening. You can see the openings here in the canopy because trees have been removed. Pines have been selectively left. There are some oaks as well, but that light that comes through the canopy allows for this rich vegetative layer. And all of these small shrubs and small saplings provide nesting habitat for shrub nesting birds in addition to canopy nesting birds. So it's a richer habitat for a broader diversity of songbird species in addition to many other wildlife. This is another picture of these areas down here of shortleaf pine woodland. They're just gorgeous. So there have been other reintroductions of the brown-headed nuthatch in Florida. So this was in the late 90s, 2017, 2019. They've done some other ones and they found, excuse me, they've moved birds to previously extirpated portions of Florida. So they have moved birds and they found positive growth rates and successful resighting, pairing of the birds, nesting of the birds. And so this gave us confidence too that this bird can handle translocation. There's been other background research between the Forest Service and the University of Missouri that simulated through computer modeling. Sometimes we use computer modeling to simulate land management out into the future to give us a good idea of how to plan for conservation, how to plan for land management. And we can simulate what may happen to the landscape and how that could benefit different populations of different wildlife. So the Forest Service and MU, this is their peer-reviewed journal article here. They simulated tree harvest or tree thinning and prescribed burning 100 years into the future. And with management, shortleaf pine becomes the most dominant tree group in the Missouri Ozarks. With management, with that prescribed burning and tree thinning, because this tree just does very well in some of the conditions and some of the climatic changes that are occurring. So this provides support for habitat for nuthatches into the future with that management. So then we went into this project saying, well, we need to answer some questions first. We need to know whether a reintroduction is feasible here in Missouri. So first of all, we had two main research questions that are pretty clear, clear cut. Are Arkansas source populations stable enough to support removal of a few birds? We were thinking about 100 birds, a small population at first. And does Missouri have suitable pine woodland habitat to support a population? We clearly cannot do anything without answering these questions and making sure that the birds have a good shot clearly at survival, and the population, the host population, would do all right. So this is how, especially Tom Bono, again, that professor at Mizzou, and Frank Thompson, the Forest Service biologist, they led the charge on these analyses. And what they did is there are long-term songbird point counts from Region 8, which is the southeastern states. You see them here. So they had a long-term point count data set, bird point count data set from 1992 to 2017. So volunteers went out to these same points over this full long time frame, 25 years, and counted the birds they heard or saw in a set amount of time. So we have this bird data over this large amount of time. So what they did is they took these data, they pulled out all of the points at which brown-headed nuthatches were detected. Then these points were also paired with vegetation data. And so they were able to look at the habitat characteristics around the points where nuthatches were detected. So we were able to build kind of a semi-habitat model to look at what the habitat looked like around the points where nuthatches were, showing what they may be preferring habitat-wise. So this is what they found. They found that the variables related to abundance in the Ouachita National Forest, oh yes, all these point counts were done in national forests. You could see them in dark gray on the map. These were the two national forests of interest to us. They were the closest to us with breeding populations of nuthatches. So we wanted to assess how the bird populations were doing in those national forests. So in the Ouachita National Forest, we found we have brown-headed nuthatch abundance on the y-axis here. And we have basal area of pines in this graph, meaning it's a kind of a general measurement of mature large pines. And when those increased, the brown-headed nuthatch abundance increased as well, which is not shocking to us. We found that their abundance was greatest at overstory canopy cover, about 60%. So again, they need that very open managed woodland. There's also a need to have a few snags around the point. So snags are those dead standing trees. And when we got to about 2 snags per hectare, kind of leveled out here. So we need some snags on the landscape around the point. And then we also found that their abundance was greater at areas of less mid-story canopy cover. So again, the more open that mid-story is, the greater abundance birds were found. So this is kind of our semi-habitat analysis for Arkansas for those 2 national forests. So then we applied that habitat model and those vegetation characteristics that the birds seem to be choosing. And we applied it to Missouri to see how much habitat we had in the state. So the Mark Twain CFLRP sites that were those study sites where the Mark Twain was restoring shortleaf pine, they compared well. So you see the darker blue on the map is greater habitat suitability for brown-headed nuthatches. So we have some habitat in those CFLRP sites. So then we did an assessment of those source populations of those 2 national forests to look at trends. Since 1997, the nuthatch population on the Ouachita National Forest, which is the top graph and the red national forest, they've seen a 6.5% increase in nuthatch population annually. And most of that has been in the last decade. Unfortunately, we didn't have precise enough estimate of trends on the Ozark St. Francis National Forest in green up here to get a precise estimate of trends, but the number of detections is at least holding steady, not declining. So then we wanted to estimate density across the Ouachita National Forest in Arkansas, because that wasn't good enough just to see a trend. We wanted to estimate how many birds were across that national forest. So the way that the data are collected through that large effort, that 25-year bird data set, we didn't have the appropriate data to do an analysis to look at an estimated density. So we went down ourselves in March of 2019 to obtain densities across the Ouachita to do our own point counts. So We took 6 days. We took 6 people down there over 3 days. We ran 12 routes of points and we covered 362 points in 3 days with this group of folks. We had pretty poor weather conditions, but we still recorded detections and were able to get an estimate. So here we compare the habitat model from those long-term national forest bird counts on the left, that land bird model, to the validation model that our data we went down and collected is working to validate from 2019 on the right. So you can see that the model on the right with our data we collected in March of 2019 boosted the estimates and increased the nuthatch density. You see more dark blue pretty much by about 25 to 50%. So us going down and collecting those extra data was useful and helped us to make a more precise model. So then we were able to estimate the abundance of brown-headed nuthatches in the Ouachita National Forest. The land bird model that we talked about, that long-term bird point count data, just those data gave us a general estimate of about 8,700 birds. With our data incorporated, the estimate was bumped up to about 21,000. So even if we assumed a 100-meter fixed radius on these land bird point counts, so it's likely that this population is somewhere in the middle, probably around 10,000 birds. So we felt that that was robust enough to remove about 100 birds across the national forest. So then, after all of these analyses and all of these discussions for a few years, we brought all of the project partners together in August of 2019 in our Mark Twain National Forest. We did a big tour of pine woodlands. We brought everyone together. We presented all these data. We had Forest Service staff from the Ouachita National Forest, our Missouri Mark Twain National Forest. We had other Mark Twain National Forest staff. We had both of our state agencies, Missouri Department of Conservation, Arkansas Game and Fish Commission, Central Hardwoods Joint Venture, which is a migratory bird group in the state and across 5 states actually of the Central Hardwoods. The point is we brought together every partner and we said, should we or shouldn't we? Should we move forward with this? Do we feel confident with this? And we got the green light. So everyone was very excited about it. So I want to talk here really briefly about our motivations for the reintroduction. Why would we want to reintroduce nuthatches to Missouri? And so the first one is habitat restoration. There's extensive shortleaf pine woodland restoration that has been happening for about 20 years. It's really been ramped up in the last decade due to CFLRP. It has continued support for pine woodland restoration and management in the future from the Mark Twain and with other conservation partners. Climate models support both the primary tree species of shortleaf pine and the habitat and the birds' trends using habitat created in Missouri. The nuthatch reintroduction and bringing back the bird is just one piece of ecosystem restoration. It's a low cost and low risk part of ecosystem restoration. And what that means is not only bringing back the pine woodland, not only bringing back the habitat and its open woodland structure, but also species that used to be here that we may have lost along the way. Also, the Arkansas source population is increasing, which gives us confidence in that as well. And the last one is that these birds had the official designation of extirpated. The sole motivation of bringing the bird back is not just that it used to be here. It's not a responsible move, and we wanted to do these analyses beforehand clearly to know that it was the right move for the birds. We never would have moved the birds if we didn't feel that they would be successful. And so again, it's just bringing the nuthatch is just one piece of that ecosystem restoration, which again is supported by the tree species of pine, shortleaf pine, and the habitat that's projected to do well in the face of a changing climate. So our reintroduction plan, now we're at the fun part where I show lots of pictures. So the reintroduction plan, our plan was to reintroduce about 100 birds over 2 years in fall of 2020 and fall of 2021 from the Ouachita National Forest in Arkansas to the Mark Twain National Forest in Missouri. So based on these analyses, we reintroduced 46 nuthatches last summer in August and 56 this year in 2021. So a little bit about the technicalities of how we did this. It went from the birds went from the Ouachita in Arkansas. We trapped 102 birds total. We used elevated mist nets. So if you've ever heard much about bird trapping, we use mist nets, which this photo's fisheye lens is a little bit distorted, but you can see our metal poles here. They have a net across it that you really can't see. That's the point. The bird doesn't see the net. It flies into these pockets that lay flat. It flies into a pocket, gets stuck down in the pocket. You walk up, safely extract the bird out of the net. They're elevated, they're on painter's poles, you can see here in the picture, so we were able to move them up higher into the canopy. This bird hangs out up in the canopy nearly all day long. So our biggest challenge was to get the birds down out of the canopy low enough so that they would fly into our nest. So we used con-specific playback, which just means we played songs, the squeaky song of the brown-headed nuthatch, to entice the birds to come closer, make them think there were other birds down lower, and they come down and they're like, why are there other birds in my territory? So they come down to investigate, and we tried to get them to go into the nest. We also use decoys, as you can see here in the picture, to help lure these birds from high in the canopy where they prefer to be, where they forage. So this is a funny picture. So we were very fortunate to have Napadal Pathong, who is one of the most amazing photographers ever. You may have seen him, you may have met him before, but I'm sure you've seen his photographs in the Missouri Conservationist magazine, which is our free publication. He's an incredible photographer. He was able to come down to Arkansas and document our trapping of the birds, and he came north with us with the birds and was able to take photos there as well. So he was able to capture really amazing photos of this picture of me where I look like I'm about to lose it. You can imagine after 2.5 years of planning, and we were there on the first morning, and the birds that I was staring at in this picture were not going into the net. So this is my terrified face. This is my stressed face, trying to will the birds to fly into the net. But he also took lots of other amazing photos, not just candid photos of me freaking out. But we did catch birds, and this is a picture of us extracting the birds from that netting that I talked about. This is my advisor, Frank Thompson. And so translocation, we transported the birds, 1 bird per tube, in 4 by 10 inch cardboard mailing tubes. We spared no expense with your taxpayer dollars. We put a 1/4 inch dowel shoved through the bottom for a perch. We bought some tulle, like tutus are made out of. We cut up the fabric and put it over the top of the tube with a rubber band, and the birds stayed in just fine. Sometimes they grasped onto the top, as you can see in this photo right here, with their huge feet. These birds climb along the trunks and the branches predominantly to eat, so they need those huge, huge feet, as all nuthatches have. We put about 5 live mealworms in each tube, most of which were eaten. So that was a good sign. Sometimes we were catching these birds right off the roost early in the morning, and so they were hungry. So some of them ate them up, some of them didn't. And then we flew the birds north using a small MDC aircraft. Transport time from trapping to release was about 4 to 5 hours, which was significantly less than if we had driven the birds. And because birds this small had really not been moved to our knowledge over such a long area, we wanted to be as cautious as possible and make that transport time as minimal as we could. So here's one of the birds we pulled out of the tube, and he was mid mealworm eating, so we interrupted his breakfast. So here are a few pictures from down through the netting I took of the birds with my phone. You can see that the cardboard mailing tubes are ventilated with a drill, and here's the little dowel you see at the bottom. And through all of transport, and really they're just very hardy birds. They didn't show any signs of stress. They just sat on the perch and hung out. This is a video on the left of one of the birds in the tubes while we were up in the aircraft at about 10,000 feet, and the bird's just hanging out. They don't show any signs of stress or, it didn't worry us much at all. We were worried the first day, but they seemed to handle it all just fine. At release, we attached a USGS Federal Bird Banding Lab aluminum band to one leg and a unique color combination of plastic bird bands on the other leg. You can see those bands here. We aged the birds, looking at molt on the body. And then we weighed the birds in a tiny old film canister, tucking them upside down and sticking their head into the canister onto a scale. Here's some pictures of us processing the birds. Got lots of good pictures with the birds of all of us, and attaching some of these colored leg bands here. And here's the silver federal band. They all have a little code imprinted on them. So it's a unique band, both federal band and a unique color combination, so we can recite the birds. Here's some more pictures of those. And then we also took a few ventral feathers from the breast for DNA sexing. These birds look the same across the sexes. So we had to pull a few feathers, send them off for DNA analysis to get the sex of the birds. Then on half of the birds, we attached a VHS radio tag transmitter so that we could follow the birds around with an antenna for about a month until the tag's batteries died, to get information on survival of the birds. Here you can see the little tag. These tags were 0.29 grams. So very, very lightweight, and they still lasted a month with a battery that tiny. The piece of paper is under there. Just while we did the super gluing, we have a little piece of elastic that goes around the bird's legs and is hidden under the feathers. We glue it, and then we put the paper underneath so that we don't get glue on the bird's feathers, and then we slide that paper out, and the bird is wearing the transmitter like this. There's just a great shot of that wedge bill that they excavate all their cavities with. They're just very, very cool birds. Look at this hallux, this back toenail, this little claw. It's just huge for all that climbing up and down branches and trunks. Here's our girl squad of processing the birds here on the left. This is Kristen and Amanda. And then here's my advisor, Frank, letting a bird go. Another great photo of Knox mid-flight as it comes out of Frank's hands into the Missouri Ozarks. Here's a picture of one of our release sites. Just really beautiful part of the state. And then we tracked the birds after we released them. This was in 2020. We thought we were doing great in 2020. After 3 days of releases, I think we had about 20 birds already. We were feeling really good about it. And then 2 hurricanes, you remember from 2020 in the fall. The weather from those hurricanes came up through the Midwest and shut us down for weeks. So it was rainy. Our aircraft was very small. We couldn't fly it in the rain. And so that shut us down for a while, but we did as much tracking as we could in rain, not lightning. But we tracked the birds around looking at survival. And then every month since we've done both releases of both years, we've done monthly surveys of the birds to, again, look at ongoing survival. And so we found after a few months of just trying to recite the birds' color bands with our binoculars, while we were getting better at it, it's very hard to see color bands that are this big, about 70, 80 feet high up in the canopy of pines. So we realized we needed to do something else. We actually got the idea from a birder who went down to see the birds. They took very close up, zoomed in photos of the birds. So we thought that's a good idea. And we got some really nice cameras to use for part of our reciting surveys. So you see some of these pictures here. You can see some of the color bands on their legs from some of these zoomed in photos. One person has binoculars during the survey and they try and see what color bands they can see. The second person has his camera and they're just taking a bunch of pictures of any of the birds. But when you zoom into these pictures, you can see that this bird is red, black on right. You can see that this is red, black on right. The bands are red from top to bottom, left leg first. So I guess this is silver, yellow, black. This is silver, red, black, and then orange, white, things like that. So this was another picture we took that was the best picture I think we've taken the whole time, but it was 3 nuthatches in one picture. Here they are on that limb. And when you zoomed in, we got green, green on left, yellow, white on left, and yellow, blue on left. So that was a good one. It was a good picture. We were able to get the color bands. Even photos like this, where you just see the bird, you just lay on the shutter, try and take a bunch of pictures. When you zoom in, you see that the color band is red, green on left. So this is just, these are the 2020 from last year, the grid points that we conducted these monthly surveys for since about November 2020. So the left white star you see in the middle of these grid points, that was the release site from 2020. In 2021, we released half the birds at last year's release site at that white star, but then we added an eastern release site due to areas where the birds had been hanging out based on our 2020 surveys. This is 2021, so we're glad that we chose a second release site because we were detecting the birds even farther roving out in useful habitat. So you can see that broader distribution across the area and exploratory movements up to 5 kilometers away from the release site, which is very cool. And then nesting this last spring, after just the first year's release of 46 birds, we did have confirmed nesting. We didn't break them, which was very comforting. We found 6 active nests from March to May 2021. They're very early nesters because they're cavity nesters, which generally nest earlier in the breeding season. We installed predator guards on each snag after the incubation of eggs was initiated, which included really aluminum foil around the the snag. It didn't appear to influence their behavior at all, and it keeps snakes from climbing up the snag to get into the hole. And then we also applied some pepper spray around the base of the snag to try and deter small mammals from getting in there and predating the nest. Again, none of the birds seemed to care about these predator guards, and we didn't have any birds abandoned due to this. So we had 2 nests that apparently were abandoned for unknown reasons. Something may have happened to the female. But ultimately, 4 nests were successful out of a population of 46 birds and 18 females, which is not terrible. And one of these birds nested in a roost box. So when we released the birds, we installed some human-made roost boxes to try and help them along as winter months were coming so that they wouldn't have to excavate their own roosts. We've seen pretty limited use of those roost boxes, but one bird nested in one, so that was kind of cool. This is a picture of one of our nest snags, these dead pine trees. So we would check the nest using an endoscope like this one. You can just see it's a tiny, it hooks up, honestly, it hooks up through Bluetooth on your phone. You download an app, you turn the camera on, and you're able to see what's on the camera on your phone. Technology is crazy. You poke this little tiny camera that's just the size of a wire into the hole, and you can get really cool pictures like these. Here's nest contents of 5 eggs in one nest. Here you can see the babies have hatched, probably on hatch day because they're blind and naked. And then we could also take videos. So this is a video we took of checking one of the nest cavities. Poke the camera down in there and you can see that there are nestlings, they're begging. You can see those open mouths and you can count the nestlings to get nest contents. On another day, here's another video. That's me holding the camera. You poke the camera in there and there are the nestlings. These guys were about to pop. They fledged the very next day, but they look very similar to the adults when they fledge plumage-wise. They have that yellow gape at the corner of their mouth that helps their mouths open wide to beg. But yeah, they look a lot like the adults. These were photos that we had taken of one male up here. You can see his color bands, red, white on left, on top of a snag with 2 of his fledglings, because you can tell they're fledglings and newly fledged birds here in Missouri because they don't have any bands on. So that's exciting that we know that any bird who doesn't have any bands on is a new bird that was born here. So again, we had so many partners throughout this project. It was very cool. These are 3 folks from Tall Timbers Research Station. They're a place in northern Florida, and they traveled during COVID with 2 weeks of quarantine necessary on both ends of the trip to drive all the way up here 12.5 hours to help us trap birds. Jim Cox on the left is a researcher there, and he's been working with brown-headed nuthatches for about 12 years. So they were an invaluable partner to us, both with, methods on how to trap the birds, just learning about the birds in general, and they came up and helped us trap, which was very cool. Just one story of partnerships really paying off. Post-reintroduction, we received a lot of cool press, including Audubon magazine. We made the BBC Wildlife's 50 Reasons to be Cheerful in 2021. And we also made Cornell Lab of Ornithology's Living Bird magazine. I think that this project was kind of a bright spot and a positive story in a pretty rough year. Another plug just for woodlands, they're great for wildlife. So they're just a more diverse system because they provide more places for a broader suite of birds to nest. And so multiple studies in Missouri, right here in our state, and the Midwest on both oak and pine woodlands show that a broader suite of these declining species in the state benefit from woodland management than those to which it is not beneficial. So these are all species outlined in our Missouri Bird Conservation Plan in the pictures here that nest in woodland. Woodlands are also great for birding. So I'm also excited for the reintroduction to draw birders to the region down in the Ozarks. I'm in Columbia, Missouri. So birding and wildlife watchers are growing in popularity rapidly, and birding is a major economic driver. And so I'm hopeful that more birders and Missourians will experience and learn about these pine woodlands and go down and see them and spend some time and money in this beautiful part of the state. So I encourage you to do so. So thank you everyone for your time. Profuse apologies for being interrupted twice by my doorbell. I really am so sorry. I did not see that coming clearly. I appreciate your time and I'd be happy to take any of your questions.
It's the Zoom world we live in. It happens, and
It's awful. Okay.
Email notifications, phone rings,
I
people
know.
at the door.
I know.
That's fascinating research. How long did it take you to capture 100 brown-headed nuthatches?
So the first year, again, it took about a month, but that wasn't a month of full trapping. So again, we were cocky. So after the first 3 days, we'd set aside like 2 weeks to do the trapping the first year, not knowing how many we would catch every day. And for 3 days, we were trapping a good number of birds. We had about 20 or 21. I don't remember the exact number, but we were feeling good because our goal for that year was 50. And so, yes, then this hurricane weather came up. We had to wait weeks. We had to wait for an opening for the aircraft. We had to wait for a lot of things. And so after that, we did like 2 or 3 trips down there where we would fly down in the evening, drive an hour out to the sites, set up all our nets, get all ready, go to sleep at an Airbnb, go down there in the morning, open up the nets, trap the birds, run to the airport. We would fly with the birds north and we'd drive them to the release site, do all the banding, go back to the airport, fly south that day, go set up nets. It was crazy. We did that about 2 or 3 more times. It was very exhausting. So this year I said, we're not doing that. We're just going to try and inundate with a lot more trappers down there in Arkansas. And it worked. It took us 7 days and we got more than our 50 bird goal for that year, coming to a total of 102. So it's a lot about learning the birds' mannerisms and behaviors and how to get them to come down out of the canopy. But it took about, I guess, 2 or 3, 4 trapping sessions, the first year, and about 6 or 7 days the second year.
That doesn't seem like a long time to me. Of course, I wasn't going out. I wasn't out there in the woods doing that, but it's pretty quick. I would think. Paula asked question. Are you telling people exactly where these have been released, where people can go see them?
Yeah, if people are interested, shoot me an email. So it's sarah.kendrick@mdc.mo.gov. I can put that in the chat as well. But yeah, reach out to me if you plan on going down there. It's easier and harder at different times of year. If you go down when they're breeding in March, April, and May, they're very quiet. They're very, very quiet birds. They just don't make a lot of sound. They don't sit out on a branch and just sing and sing and sing like some other territorial male songbirds do. And so if I have knowledge of where exactly you can go to hear the birds, I'll encourage you to go to that spot. So just let me know if you are headed down there, and I'm happy to tell you where to go. But in general, the release sites are in the Mark Twain National Forest south of Fremont, Missouri. So it's between Winona and Van Buren. There's Fremont in the middle. You go south on Highway J off of Highway 60. And you go down until you reach Pine Knot Road, and they're right there. So it's no secret where a lot of these big swaths of shortleaf pine woodland are, and you can just go hang out there and listen for their squeaky call. But yeah, if you're planning a trip down there, just let me know.
Is it legal for people to play a recording of their call?
That's a really great question. I'm glad you asked that. So it's not illegal, but we really, really ask that people do not, because, these birds already have some level of stress, right? Because they've been reintroduced. We want to give them every possible chance. And every time you play playback around a breeding bird, especially males, respond very intensely. They hear another bird, they think they're in their territory. And all of that, anything we do to birds, even, trapping them or doing surveys, can kind of influence their behavior. And they just get really kind of stressed and agitated when they think another male's there. So we don't want to add a lot of that stress and behavior. But they do respond quickly to playback, but we're asking people not to do that because it can cause them undue stress in an already stressful time after being reintroduced. But they do seem to be very hardy birds. I mean, we had no confirmed mortalities during trapping, transport, or release. That's not always the case with songbirds, unfortunately, but these birds just seem to be very hardy. They seem to handle all of it very, very well. Good
I would love to go down and see one.
Yeah.
And I put that in chat. I was asking if anyone watching today have seen one. So I definitely want to do that in the coming year.
Yeah.
Lori has a question. Did you determine sex of the, you talked about that. You did determine the sex of the birds before you released them, correct?
Yes. Oh, no, not before release. It was after. So it took a few weeks. So really, we were just trying to trap as many birds as we could. And after we did the DNA sexing, we thought that if we had a completely skewed sex ratio, we could go back and try and target net or figure out some ways through vocalizations to determine sex. Jim Cox down at Tall Timbers in Florida has some thoughts on vocalizations and whether they're male or female. And so we just really were super lucky. We had 27 males and 18 females the first year. The second year, I think it was 33 and 22. It was almost the exact same percentage of male and female the second year. It was crazy. So males and females do respond to the playback relatively equally. It's a little bit skewed, but not bad. And so, yes, we just happen to be very lucky with sex ratio, but we were prepared to deal with that if it was an issue.
Do the color bands indicate sex?
They do not. No, and really, we didn't know sex when we released them. So we were just, they're all unique though. No bird has the same color band combination. And so we did that to be able to track individuals. And so when we do the surveys and the birds come in, we get those color band sightings, and then we put all of that into a spreadsheet so we can track how many times we've seen each of those birds. It helps go into survival models of how well the birds are doing and things like that.
Excuse me. Do you know how many of the 102 birds actually survived the first year? Do you have a guess? Or?
So it's impossible for us to know, but our survival models based on all of these surveys is about 65%, I think, 63 or 65%, which sounds kind of low, but it's really not. So in established breeding populations, brown-headed nuthatch survival is around that. It's about 66%. So we're very close, and we're a reintroduced population. So you imagine it'll be a little bit lower. But it's impossible for us to know exactly how many have survived and how many haven't, but our survival models have been pretty heartening on with the birds we have recited, how they're doing.
And second part of that question, 4 nests, Brad writes, 4 nests sounds low. What do you find in Arkansas? Is 4 nests for that? For 60 some birds, is that low? Or
I imagine that there were more, we just didn't find them. And so, yeah, so with our sex ratio, that was just the first year's birds. It was only 4, correct, but we found 6 nests and we had 18 females. So we found a third of the nests if all of the females initiated the nest. If you think about survival and some of those birds may have died, we can't confirm that, we don't know that. But if some of those birds have died, it's pretty good ratio that you're finding a third of the females initiating a nest. And yeah, even though only 4 fledged, we probably fledged about 20 to 24 birds, which in a population of 46 birds, getting 50% gain in the population, even though that number of nests seems low, is doing very well. So I do imagine the birds had just roved out to other pine woodland outside of our search areas, and that there were birds nesting. We just haven't confirmed, that's just a guess. But yeah, it's not that terrible when you put it in terms of there were just 18 females and we found 6. So
yeah, there probably were at least a few more.
Could have been, yeah.
Yeah. Will it be possible someday that the population in Arkansas merges? I don't know if that's the correct word. With the population in Missouri. Is there enough suitable habitat?
I don't think at this time there's enough suitable habitat connecting the two, but just about a month ago, there have been off and on a few detections of individual brown-headed nuthatches found up here, outside of their breeding range. There are always just going to be some crazy birds go wild and just fly off and disperse, and they're found up here. So just about a month ago, there was one, a brown-headed nuthatch they determined in Kansas that was west of you all. I forget exactly where in Kansas it was, but it was just detected for a few days or weeks, and then it's gone. I don't remember if it's still there or not, but you'll always have those roving individuals, and so there may be some roving individuals that come up here from Arkansas. But until we expand that pine woodland management and more of that habitat and chunks of that habitat between here and their existing breeding population, it may be tough. But yes, that's the hope, is that the population grows and spreads out to more and more of these areas that we manage.
We have Anthony watching from upstate New York, and he asked, are there similar nuthatch introductions being done elsewhere in the country? I
don't know of any, no. And there are some people, there are groups over the last 20, 30 years that have reintroduced red-cockaded woodpeckers. They're an endangered species, and they use the exact same pine woodland habitat. Their numbers have gone down a lot. They're a federally endangered species. And so they've reintroduced those birds and moved them around. I don't believe that we have enough habitat or large enough pines here in the state for red-cockaded woodpeckers at this point, maybe in the next few decades, but we just don't have. We need a lot more shortleaf pine, and we need larger trees, because red-cockaded woodpeckers excavate nesting cavities in live oaks, not dead ones. And so, so we just need a lot more habitat for them. But yes, there have been others in this system in this woodlands system, pines in particular, but no, I don't know of any that have happened on this larger scale, I guess. They've done some other reintroductions, as I mentioned, in Florida to previously located portions of the state, but I don't know. But I think that we're the largest translocation of a bird this small.
It's a great success story. You mentioned the BBC, I wrote it down, named it one of the 50 reasons to be cheerful. And I had meant to say earlier, it's nice to hear positive news, especially about bird populations.
It's a cool,
here's a success story. Yeah,
it's a cool conservation story. You know, like the biologists with the Mark Twain National Forest saw the potential for this down in this part of the state in, you know, the late 80s, early 90s. They saw the potential for this. They put their noses to the grindstone. They did a lot of work. They brought back habitat, and we were just able to bring back a species that we may have lost a long, long time ago. So yeah, it is an exciting story. Just ignore the fact that there may not have been that much to be cheerful about in 2021 to make the BBC's list. But no, it is a happy conservation story. Yeah.
All right, Dave asks, any honeysuckle issues in these new areas?
Not a lot. No, I think the biggest invasive plant issue is Lespedeza, where some of these logging trucks come in. I mean, logging and tree removal is part of this system. I mean, for a lot of these forests to continue and be healthy, you have to remove some of the trees. There's a lot of logging down in this part of the state, but not to a detrimental, you know, level. And for these woodland sites, that's part of it. We need to remove a lot of those trees to open that canopy up and then maintain it over time with prescribed fire. And so some of the logging trucks, the seeds of Lespedeza and things like that get stuck on the trucks, and you know, you'll see it along the roadways sometimes. But no, honeysuckle is not an issue down in this part of the state. No, it's more so an issue around urban areas, I've found.
Okay. Well, and you just answered a question. Someone asked about controlled burns. Do they play a role in this effort? You mentioned that they do, correct?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, you need a fire to maintain these woodland sites. You can tell in the background on all these pictures that the bottoms of these pines are charred because they can handle the fire, because these are low burning fires. They're not massive forest fires. And local area managers with the Mark Twain or our conservation department or others, anybody that does prescribed fires, they look at the weather, they look at the moisture, all of that. It's called a controlled burn for a reason. It is very controlled. They have a lot of people on the edges, and they plan these for weeks and wait for the perfect weather on burn days. They call them you need to do it today because the weather's perfect. It's not going to get out of control. The wind isn't high. The moisture's perfect. So all of it is very, very controlled to be as safe as possible. But yes, it requires fire to set back that succession. If you didn't burn these areas ever again in woodland, they just grow back all woolly and full and not as useful to wildlife over time anyway. So they don't regulate themselves. They require that management on landscape that was historically there.
Are you looking at other forests in Missouri to repopulate with brown-headed nuthatches? What if, and someone asked, is there a benefit for planting a shortleaf pine in my neighborhood in Kansas City?
Well, there's always a benefit to planting a shortleaf pine.
Can we team up here in Kansas City and plant a bunch of shortleaf pines? And
you're going to need a lot more, though. You need to talk some folks into growing it at scale. But no, I mean, shortleaf pine does best in our Ozarks because it thrives in that rocky soil. You can barely even call it soil. If any of you have spent any time in the Ozarks, it's rock. And so shortleaf pine does best on those nasty, rocky soils. And so up here, it can or cannot do well. But, you know, in mid-Missouri up to North Missouri, you can't plant you could plant a bunch of shortleaf pine, but historically and ecologically, they just didn't thrive up here. It was down in the Ozarks due to the conditions of the soil and the area. And so I don't know how effective it would be. I planted one in our backyard here in Columbia, and it looks pretty sad. But they are working to expand shortleaf pine management in the Ozarks where we do have pine. You know, pine really only occurs in this part of the state down in our Ozarks. And so it's kind of a niche area, but they are looking to expand management of it. And I would be happy to see that.
All right, Susan writes, fascinating. Thanks for sharing. Jamie writes, what an uplifting story. Thank you. And yeah, I agree. What a great story. Kathleen has a question. First, she says, congratulations to you and your crew. What an awesome outcome for our state. Is it known if any other species have benefited from the newly opened woodlands?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, all those species that I showed, I'll actually share my screen again to show you. So in 2019, we did the Missouri Bird Conservation Plan. The point of the Missouri Bird Conservation Plan was to outline our most threatened species in the state. And then it was a call to action to both public and private landowners on what habitat to manage and what habitat to create for our most threatened and most declining species. So if you want to look that up, you just Google Missouri Bird Conservation Plan MDC, and you'll find a PDF of it online. It's the technical section, but it outlines our most threatened species. We assign a Missouri concern score to give context for how threatened they are. We show information on their declines, what habitats they use, and the whole plan is outlined by habitat type. So we have forest, woodland, and early successional, which covers these species, grassland. So if you manage an area that has a lot of grassland, you can read it. And if you want to help contribute to our declining birds, you can help us manage that for declining species. But all of these species right here on this slide, we have 29 of our most threatened species outlined in the plan. And this is 8 of them that all require woodland. But yeah, like I said before, it provides so much more nesting substrate. So it helps more species. There's birds that nest up here in the canopy, some that nest in parts of the subcanopy, and then ones that nest in these shrubs off the ground, and then ones that nest on the ground. And all of these species cover that wide gamut of different nesting substrates. So when you open up a forest and make it a woodland and put prescribed fire on there to keep it open, you're maintaining so much more nesting substrate. So it appeals to a broader diversity of our declining species. And I think they may be declining because there's less and less of these managed woodlands out on a landscape for them to choose from than in the past.
Hey, Sarah, could you keep that screen up?
Yeah.
For a second? We had a question asking if you could identify each of those species.
Yes. So there's an eastern towhee right here. They nest on the ground and they feed in the leaf litter. So even though you're using prescribed fire and you consume the leaves a lot, the leaves come back after the next year. And this bird has a lot of places to nest. They nest like at the base of shrubs or plants, make their nests right there. This is a blue-winged warbler. They're kind of an edge species, but they need shrubs. They need thick, shrubby stuff. This is a prairie warbler. They require like 3+ acres of open area with shrubs. And so they're kind of more habitat limited. So you need a lot more of this open, very shrubby, kind of early successional young forest, and a lot of it in one patch for them to nest. But prairie warblers are one of the most gorgeous birds in our state. Bobwhite quail, of course, which are game species, so they can appeal to some landowners who like to hunt them. But it doesn't matter. Sure, put in grassland and early successional habitat because it doesn't just help quail, it helps this wide swath of species. Red-headed woodpecker, cavity nester, of course, they need open park-like settings, so you find them in very open parks as well as very managed open woodlands. Eastern wood pewee, which nest across from very open all the way to closed canopy forests. They're a canopy nester. Yellow-breasted chat, they're such weird and awesome birds, and they need shrubs. They need that open area as well. All these birds can be found all over our study sites where nuthatches are. And then yellow-billed cuckoo, which are kind of a canopy nester. They nest in like grapevine tangles, but they're all over these woodlands. And this is just a small number of the birds that use woodland. They're just such rich systems.
Thank you for that. I can get about 4 or 5 of those. I wasn't sure.
Good job. That's good.
I wasn't sure about the warbler. I knew it was a warbler, but
yeah,
I wasn't sure. So we are at the top of the hour. So let's go with one more question. And I want to ask you a question. We just heard you identify birds. What's your go-to bird field guide?
That's a good question. So I actually pulled a few when you told me you were going to ask this question. So I like the Nat Geo Birds of Eastern US. A lot of people use the Sibley guide, which is also a good one, but I think this is an especially good one for beginners. So Birds of Eastern US. If you're a super nerd, which is a good thing, you get the Warbler Guide, which is all about warblers. Look how huge this book is. It talks about every plumage type of juveniles, first year, if you get into warbling and you get into birding, this is your book. It's awesome. And then this book was written by my predecessor, Brad Jacobs. It's more of a coffee table book, but it is just beautiful and has lots of beautiful artwork. It's for sale through the Conservation Department's Nature Shop. It's a great Christmas gift. It's like 40 bucks, and it's more of a coffee table book. And so my predecessor was Brad Jacobs, and he was an amazing, amazing birder, amazing ornithologist, and he wrote this book. So it's very, very cool book, and he just passed away in 2020. So yeah, that's a great gift idea too. So a few different options.
Very nice, very nice. Well, thank you, Sarah, for taking the time to talk about your fascinating research today. I'm looking forward, I think everyone's looking forward to following along the progress of the brown-headed nuthatch.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. It's always great to talk to everybody about it.
And thank you all for attending today's program. For more information about upcoming events at both the Kansas City Public Library and the Linda Hall Library, visit kclibrary.org and lindahall.org.